Church accountability, how the Vatican is cracking down on abuse. Abortion funding, why President Joe Biden's budget causes concern for pro-lifers. Border crisis, the push to help migrant children while cracking down on immigrants. And Rosary Marathon, Catholics look to Our Lady for renewed strength and help with the coronavirus pandemic. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, June 1st, 2021. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. Pope Francis changes Catholic Church law to criminalize sexual abuse by priests. A Vatican official from the Pontifical Council for Legislative Text says the new measures are more complete.
There was always a critique that abuse of minors was seen as an offense against special obligations, the celibacy or the vow of chastity. Now these delicts find themselves in a new title: offenses against life, dignity and liberty of persons.
EWTN Newsroom correspondent Colin Flynn gives us the main points of this change in canon law from Rome.
The major change to the law is the recognition that adults too can be victimized by priests who abuse their authority. And the Vatican has now officially criminalized the grooming of minors or vulnerable adults by priests, including compelling them to engage in pornography. This is the first time that the church law has officially criminally recognized some of the methods used by sexual predators to build relationships with their victims. The new laws also remove much of the discretion that had long allowed bishops and religious superiors to ignore or cover up abuse, making clear that they can be held responsible for omissions and negligence in failing to properly investigate and sanction offending priests. And the law extends to cover not just priests, but also founders of lay religious movements or even church administrators. Now, as lay people cannot be defrocked, penalties include losing their jobs, paying fines, or being removed from their communities. Pope Francis said these changes were for, quote, the restoration of justice, the reform of the offender, and the repair of scandal. The new amendments of the canon law go into effect on December the 8th. In Rome, Colin Flynn, EWTN News Nightly.
The Holy Father also invited Christian leaders from Lebanon to join him at the Vatican for a day of prayer next month. Pope Francis says that he wants to address what he calls, quote, the worrying situation in the country in Western Asia. Lebanon has faced a financial and political crisis for months following a deadly blast in August. The country has failed to form a government and implement reforms. Meantime, back in Washington, President Joe Biden calls on Americans to root out racism. He traveled to Oklahoma today to remember the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre that left hundreds of black people dead.
Anything you can imagine wanting or needing in your community in 1921, the black community had here in the Greenwood District, the most prosperous, successful black-owned business district in the country during that time.
President Biden toured Greenwood Cultural Center in Tulsa before giving a speech about the solemn anniversary. Tulsa had a thriving black neighborhood that was burned by white supremacists in 1921. Our pro-life groups condemn President Joe Biden's federal budget proposal. They are upset that it leaves out the 45-year-old Hyde Amendment, which helps block taxpayer money from funding abortions. Live Action President Lila Rose writes, forcing Americans to participate financially in the killing of preborn children is immoral and gravely unjust. We urge all of Congress, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike to reject this budget and any budget that does not include basic life protections. Joining us now with analysis is Joel Griffith, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Joel, welcome back. Always great to see you. As we just mentioned, the Hyde Amendment was left out of the president's budget proposal. What are your thoughts on that, and does it come as a surprise?
Well, this is the first time in decades that the federal budget has not included the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits the federal funding of abortions. But if you look at the entirety of this budget, we know that it's unreasonable It's unsustainable. It drives social programs into insolvency, and it actually fleeces some programs like national security that are of utmost importance to this country. If you look back, it took up until 2018 before we even had a $4 trillion budget. This budget is 50% larger than it was just a few years ago, and it is going to cement into place either higher taxes or the necessity for the Federal Reserve to print the money to fund this budget, which would drive up inflation.
Yeah, and let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's talk about the numbers. Overall, this budget proposal is $6 trillion, as you know, and would increase federal spending to levels not seen in decades. President Biden said he would not increase taxes on the middle class. So exactly who will be footing the bill here, and what impact will that have on our national deficit?
Yeah, this $6 trillion, it's hard to even get our minds around it, but $6 trillion is close to $80,000 per family of four each and every single year. Now, the president might promise that the middle class won't pay for this, but we know that there is no way that the wealthy alone can pay for all of this spending. It does include in the budget a dramatic increase in the capital gains tax. And that capital gains tax, even if it only impacts directly those who are invested, it'll have a secondary impact on all of us, because the way that our quality of life increases is by investors being able to actually invest in research and development and business opportunities. When you have the government taking away that capital, that's less money that's available to be invested. So long term, to pay for this, it's either going to involve dramatic tax increases, not just on the wealthy, but also the middle class, or alternatively, it would involve the Federal Reserve printing money to buy up government debt. And if that happens, you'll end up with longer term inflation, which is a tax on all of us, rich and poor alike.
And let's talk a little bit more about what is exactly in this budget. We know funding for things like infrastructure is included, community colleges, and universal pre-K, as well as funding to help combat climate change. That said, let's talk a little bit more about what's missing from this budget. And ultimately, Joel, do you think it will pass?
Well, what's missing from this budget is actually a real serious look at what's driving us towards national bankruptcy, and that's entitlement spending. We have these on a runaway growth trajectory, and ultimately that means that many younger generations that are buying into this now by paying payroll taxes, they are not going to see the benefits of all the money that they're forced to pay each and every year. And in the components that are within the budget, such as nearly $2 trillion in infrastructure, 90-something% of that infrastructure spending does not even go towards what we think of as usual infrastructure, like bridges, roads, and freeways. It is a massive slush fund for special interests, such as a Green New Deal. And we know what that looks like. The Green New Deal has been tried and implemented across parts of Europe, and they're paying dramatically higher electricity costs and other energy costs. That's what we have to look forward to here, and it's all included in this massive $6 trillion budget.
Joel, we have probably about 30 seconds left, but real quick, final thoughts.
Well, if Congress actually passes this budget, they are putting us further down the road to national bankruptcy. When you propose nearly $80,000 per year in federal spending, you either pay for that with higher taxes or by running up the printing presses for more currency. And if you do that, you end up with inflation. We're going to pay for this either one way or the other. This budget is woefully irresponsible, impractical, and unsustainable.
And we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much, Joel. Joel Griffith, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, the Biden administration is sending Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Costa Rica today to speak with Central American officials about how to block migration to the United States. But Senate Republicans say all the administration is doing is passing the buck while the crisis continues. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, Tracy, no doubt that U.S. relations with governments in these Northern Triangle countries such as El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala have been strained as a result of this border crisis, despite President Biden planning to spend some $4 billion over the next 4 years to help these countries and their economy. Now, Republicans say you can't just continue to keep throwing money at this issue. They would like to see the re-implementation of some of former President Trump's policies, all in the name of national security. Texas Senator John Cornyn tells me the biggest scandal right now, these unaccompanied children apprehended at the border are being flown across the country.
What worries me is that there are more children in custody, about 18,000 children in custody as of May the 24th, more than double the number that were in custody during the Trump administration. Yet you hear and see very little about that.
He says previous investigations show some of these kids were placed into forced labor, gangs, and even the sex industry.
They're telling people don't come, but all their actions are nothing but incentivizing people to continue to come. That's why you've seen about 750,000 people show up at our border just in this last fiscal year.
Republicans say they'd like to see construction of the wall start up again, along with enhanced border security and funding for Border Patrol officers. Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville has introduced a bill to give state and local law enforcement more jurisdiction over immigration cases.
What we want to do is we want to empower state and local law enforcement where they can do this on their own, where if they run into this, they can handle it because it's going to overwhelm our communities.
The immigration issue is red hot. Over the next 2 days, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is holding an emergency meeting with officials from Central America as well as Vatican representatives to set forth a path for the U.S. Church's response on immigration. Faith leaders say while migrants need legal support, they also need food, housing, and education, yet they're often released into crowded and sometimes substandard living conditions with relatives. By the way, the bishops' meeting comes just days before Vice President Kamala Harris does plan to visit Guatemala and Mexico June 7th and 8th, but she is not going to go down to the U.S.-Mexico border. The visit is part of a plan to lay out U.S. policy in the region to improve the conditions so that people will want to stay in their home countries. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
China is abruptly changing its long-standing population control policies. The state will now let families have up to 3 children. China had strictly enforced its one-child policy beginning in 1980. Its two-child policy began in 2016. The government's latest decision follows a recent demographic study documenting its aging population. A government reassessment in Peru would make its COVID-19 death rate the world's highest. Officially, the virus claimed just over 69,000 lives. The toll has more than doubled with the new data and criteria. It is now believed that more than 180,000 have died in Peru from coronavirus. A volcano in eastern Congo has created a humanitarian crisis. Mount Nyiragongo began erupting last week, threatening millions in the city of Goma. More than 30 people have died. Thousands are homeless and displaced. Fresh water is scarce. Some prayed as a Sunday congregation. Ongoing earthquakes may signal a new eruption. Coming up, good grades. How Catholic schools are outpacing public peers. And First Amendment rights, the push for free speech and religious freedom on campus. Catholic schools have received some high marks for student performance. Children in grades 4 and 8 surpassed public school peers in science, reading, and math. These results are from 2 recent reports by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Their studies track pre-coronavirus benchmarks between the years 2013 and 2019. The full story is available for you online at our partner site, CatholicNewsAgency.com. A Florida State University has settled its lawsuit with a Catholic student. Jack Denton sued the school last year after he was removed from the Student Senate for private religious statements. Denton argued certain policy positions from the ACLU and BlackLivesMatter.com violated church teaching on abortion and gender issues. The messages were later made public. And joining us now is Logan Spena, legal counsel for the Center for Academic Freedom with Alliance Defending Freedom. Logan, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. What can you tell us about the settlement, and why are you describing it as a victory for Jack Denton? Also, how did he react when he heard the news?
Well, thanks so much for having me. As you mentioned a minute ago, the university recently settled with Jack. And this is a critical case because it acknowledges that students on public university campuses don't give up their rights to express their religion to other people and to participate in every university activity, including student government, on equal terms. So the university settled with Jack, they paid him damages, they corrected records on their website relating to his unconstitutional removal, and they issued a statement affirming that all students, regardless of their religion, have free access to university services and the right to participate in student government. This is a big win for Jack, and it's a big win for students everywhere. And of course, Jack reacted really well. He was extremely happy to get this case settled and to have this result, again, kind of affirming that his own removal was unconstitutional, but also protecting students everywhere.
Really great news. And also, as part of the settlement, Florida State University agreed to release a statement reaffirming the school's commitment to First Amendment rights. You kind of mentioned that. Why was that so important in terms of the agreement? And also, what do you think of the response from FSU so far?
It was so important in terms of the agreement because of the way the case played out. Jack was removed last summer by the Student Senate, and we appealed to the administration in 2 separate letters, and they refused to do anything. And so that's why we ultimately had to go to federal court and also won Jack's reinstatement from the Student Supreme Court there. So it's important to get this statement from the university affirming the right of all students to participate on equal terms.
And Logan, can you talk about sort of on the wider issue about the significance of the resolution of this case when it comes to religious freedom and freedom of speech, in particular on college campuses?
The wider issue is that we're facing an increasing intolerance with respect to religious expression, especially, both from university administrators and from student bodies in general. This case is important because it dealt with discrimination by the student government. And this case affirms that a student government at a public university, where the student government is part of a state institution, they have to respect students' constitutional rights too. And so we're extremely proud of Jack for standing up against the cancel culture mob here and affirming his own rights and every other student's.
Logan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today about this really important case. We appreciate it. Logan Spena, legal counsel for the Center for Academic Freedom with Alliance Defending Freedom. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Up next, gift of self. Pope Francis offers a lesson on Christian life. And an appeal to Our Lady. The Holy Father concludes a Rosary marathon. Pope Francis says the communion of love of the Holy Trinity is an essential part of Christian life.
Perché l'unità che nasce dall'amore, dalla misericordia di Dio.
Over the weekend, in his address on Trinity Sunday, the Holy Father said although the mystery of the Holy Trinity is not easy to understand, it is possible for every person to love just like each person of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and be a gift of self for others. Pope Francis has ended a month-long global Rosary marathon. In the Vatican gardens yesterday, the Holy Father prayed in front of an image of Our Lady, undoer of knots. He asked the Blessed Virgin to untangle the knots that oppress us materially and spiritually. By doing so, she ensures we will bear joyful witness to the love that Christ has for us and those around us. Joining us now is Father John Paul Zeller, EWTN Employee Chaplain. Father, so great to see you. So can you tell us more about the Rosary with the Pope, and also what were his intentions?
Sure. Yesterday, was the end of the Rosary Marathon Rally. And May 1st, I should say, was the beginning of the rally that throughout the world, there were 30 shrines that prayed the Rosary for special intentions for an end to the coronavirus pandemic. And I should say that there were 5 petitions, particularly last night, that the Pope prayed for, and I'll read them for you. A rediscovery of community life, relief from unemployment, an end to domestic violence, recovery from illness, and the resumption of daily pastoral ministry. This was the overarching theme of the Rosary with the Pope last night in his intentions.
Wonderful. And how was it praying together with the Holy Father? How was it experience?
It was great, Tracy. Just to be there, and I think being behind him, I felt as if a little child at my grandfather's feet. My grandfather was very important to me in my life, leading me in prayer, and I always remember him carrying the Rosary. And the Holy Father leading us in prayer as the Vicar of Christ, as a successor of St. Peter, that's a sense that I had when he was leading us in prayer. It was like a grandfather leading his children to God.
What an incredible experience. How special for you to be there. Also, can you talk to us a little bit more about Our Lady, Undoer of Knots, and why it was so important to pray to her?
Absolutely. Sure, absolutely. Pope Francis has a love for the devotion of Our Lady, Undoer of Knots, that he kind of picked up when he was in Germany studying. And this image, if you look at the image, I encourage our viewers to maybe download an image or to buy an image of Our Lady, Undoer of Knots for their homes. But the image has little knots, and it's knots in yarn, okay? And let's just relate it to our lives. Every single one of us has difficulties in our life, difficulties in our families, difficulties in work, difficulties in whatever, okay, whatever they may be in our personal lives. These knots, Our Lady is taking these knots and untying these knots like a mother would. And whenever a mother, when somebody has a knot in their shoe, usually a kid goes to their mother to undo that knot in my shoe. I remember doing it when I was a kid. My mom would untie these knots that I couldn't untie. That's what our Blessed Mother does in our lives. She unties those knots that get our lives all messed up, and she brings us more straightened out to God.
And I love that analogy. That is so true. And our mothers are so patient, too, like Our Lady undoing the knots for us. Anything else that you would like to talk about and discuss? Exactly, patience, that you would like to discuss that we haven't discussed before we wrap up our interview?
I think it's just very important for people to pray the Rosary in general. During this pandemic, we pray the Rosary every day as friars. But during this pandemic, that was something that I particularly grew in my love for, was not just praying the Rosary once a day, but I found myself wanting to pray it even more often, to pray it twice a day or even 3 times a day. And that may sound like a lot. I mean, sometimes praying the Rosary once sounds like a lot, but I encourage people to start praying it more often, and you will see a difference in your life.
No, Father, thank you so much for that, and thank you for talking to us today. We really appreciate it. Father John Paul Zeller, EWTN Employee Chaplain, thank you again.
You're welcome, Tracy. God bless you and our viewers.
And finally tonight, Pope Francis says basketball is a sport that lifts you up to heaven.
Il vostro è uno sport che eleva verso il cielo.
On Monday, Pope Francis met with the Italian Basketball Federation. He said sports can inspire young people to never give up and to discover that, just like the game, life is a journey with defeats and victories, but to never forget that if you don't shoot a hoop, you haven't lost forever. Wonderful advice. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.